Before we begin our journey tonight, take a slow breath in. Allow it to leave you at its own pace. Let your shoulders relax. Feel the weight of the day becoming a little lighter with every quiet exhale. Tonight, our destination is the Romanian Carpathian mountains. The landscape has changed over the centuries, but much of it still looks remarkably familiar. Forests cover the slopes. Rivers descend through narrow valleys, and small settlements remain scattered wherever the terrain allows people to build a few homes and cultivate the land around them. For a long time, many of these villages were difficult to reach. A journey that can now be completed in less than an hour once required an entire day on foot. During winter, heavy snow sometimes closed the mountain passes altogether. Distance was measured less by kilometers than by the time and effort needed to cross the next ridge. Under those conditions, paying attention to the natural world became part of daily life. People paid close attention to the behavior of animals, the color of the sky before sunrise, and the direction of the wind. Over generations, those observations became part of the practical knowledge passed from one family to the next. Observation could reduce uncertainty, but it could never remove it entirely. A violent hailstorm remained capable of destroying months of work in a single afternoon. For farming communities, weather was never a distant subject. It shaped ordinary decisions: the right moment to sow grain, the best day to gather hay, whether livestock should be brought back into the valley before nightfall. Across the Carpathians, memories of unusual seasons were often preserved for decades. Villagers remembered the year the river froze unusually early, the summer without rain, and the storm that stripped every apple tree before sunset. Stories traveled alongside those memories. Over time, they offered explanations for events that seemed difficult to understand, often giving natural forces a recognizable human face. Among the traditions collected by Romanian folklorists during the 19th century, one appears again in different forms. It speaks of wandering men whose knowledge exceeded that of ordinary travelers. They owned very little. They rarely remained in one place for long. Many accounts describe them arriving without announcement and leaving just as quietly, continuing their journey before the rest of the village had fully awakened. No single description survives. In one region, they appear as elderly scholars. Elsewhere, they resemble poor pilgrims or wandering teachers. The central idea remains surprisingly stable. These were individuals believed to possess an exceptional understanding of the forces that governed the natural world. The name attached to them was Solomonari. Whether such people ever existed cannot be answered with certainty. The documentary record is incomplete, and folklore has never been concerned with precision in the modern sense. Yet tradition's persistence deserves attention. Separated by distance, many communities preserved remarkably similar stories over long periods of time. That alone makes a subject worth exploring. The surviving material comes from oral tradition, from the notebooks of ethnographers, and from the observations of writers who traveled through the Romanian provinces during the 19th century. Taken together, These fragments offer a rare glimpse into the way earlier generations understood weather, knowledge, and the unexplained. Our journey begins here, among the forests and valleys of the Carpathians, where the arrival of a stranger could become the beginning of a story that would outlive everyone who first told it. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Romanian principalities had already attracted the attention of scholars, travelers, and writers interested in the customs of Eastern Europe. Alongside descriptions of local festivals, songs, and religious customs, they encountered stories that seemed to belong to a different world altogether. Among them were repeated references to unusual men known as the Solomonari. The descriptions rarely agree in every detail. A wandering scholar appears in one region, while elsewhere the tradition remembers an elderly traveller whose arrival coincided with unusually heavy rain. Villagers spoke of travellers who possessed knowledge unavailable to ordinary people, and whose presence inspired both curiosity and caution. From the perspective of a modern historian, such differences are hardly surprising. Oral traditions naturally evolve over time. Details are added, forgotten, or adapted to local circumstances, making complete consistency almost impossible. The remarkable fact is that the name itself appears across regions separated by considerable distance. Researchers collecting folklore in Transylvania encountered it. Versions of the same tradition were later recorded in Bukovina and Moldavia. Although local details changed, the central figure remained recognizable. The Romanian ethnographers, whose work preserved an extraordinary amount of traditional knowledge during the 19th century, included references to beliefs surrounding the Solomonari in their writings on popular culture and mythology. Other collectors documented similar accounts without always agreeing on their meaning or origin. Interpretations varied. Several researchers connected the stories with pre-Christian beliefs, while other studies explored possible links with medieval traditions or forms of folk scholarship. No explanation achieved universal acceptance. That uncertainty remains part of the subject even today. The written sources offer another interesting detail. Very few describe them as isolated magicians or sorcerers. Instead, they appear as educated wanderers whose abilities were closely connected with learning. Books are mentioned surprisingly often. So are schools. Knowledge itself occupies a central place in the legend. This feature distinguishes them from many other supernatural figures found in European folklore. They are remembered less for what they looked like than for what they were believed to know. For historians, that distinction raises an intriguing possibility. The legend may preserve distant memories of real individuals whose education set them apart from the communities around them. It may also represent something entirely symbolic. The available evidence leaves room for several interpretations. The stories, however, continue to circulate. And as we continue, one particular element appears again and again with striking consistency. According to Romanian folklore, a Solomonar did not simply understand the weather. Many believed he could influence it. For most people living in the Carpathians, before the 20th century, weather was not a topic of casual conversation. It was closely tied to survival. A prolonged drought affected the fields, and early frost damaged fruit trees. A severe hailstorm could undo months of careful work in less than an hour. Written records from different parts of Europe show the communities often search for explanations when confronted with events they could neither predict nor prevent. The Romanian principalities were no exception. Without access to modern meteorology, patterns in the natural world were understood through long observation, practical experience, and local tradition. When those explanations proved insufficient, folklore offered another way of making sense of uncertainty. Within that framework, the Solomonari gradually acquired a particular reputation. They were associated with rain more often than sunshine. The name appeared whenever conversations turned to storms that arrived unexpectedly, or fields that escaped damage against all expectations. The exact nature of that connection varied from place to place. In many accounts, they are presented as men capable of reading the sky with unusual accuracy. A number of traditions go further and attribute to them the ability to influence the weather itself. From a modern perspective, it is easy to separate observation from belief. For earlier generations, the distinction was not always so clear. Someone who consistently predicted a storm before anyone else might eventually become the subject of stories. This process can be observed in many cultures. Romanian folklore preserved its own variation. According to several accounts collected during the 19th century, the Solomonari were thought to possess knowledge unavailable to ordinary people. Exactly how that knowledge was acquired remained uncertain. References to forgotten books and secret teachers appear in several collections of folklore. Learning itself was often imagined as taking place far from ordinary settlements. Although these traditions differ in important ways, they share an interesting characteristic. The source of authority is almost always learning. The Solomonari are rarely described as figures born with supernatural powers. Instead, they become exceptional because they have studied something hidden from everyone else. That distinction deserves attention. It reflects a society in which knowledge itself carried an almost magical status. To read unfamiliar texts, understand the movement of the heavens, or explain natural phenomena already placed a person outside ordinary experience. Over time, imagination filled the remaining gaps. The result was a figure who occupied an unusual position, somewhere between scholar, wanderer, and keeper of forgotten traditions. Only later would the stories become even more remarkable. Some versions of the legend claim that a Solomonar did not merely anticipate storms, he traveled with them. One question still invites attention. Where did they acquire the knowledge that later became the foundation of so many legends? Romanian folklore approaches the subject with remarkable consistency, even if the details are never identical. Before appearing as wandering figures on mountain roads, they were believed to have spent years studying in a place separated from ordinary society. Its location remained uncertain. Depending on the region, the school might be located inside a cave, beyond the forests, or somewhere deep in the mountains. Many storytellers avoided assigning it any precise location. No evidence has ever confirmed that such a place existed. From a historical perspective, however, the legend says a great deal about the communities that preserved it. Formal education was uncommon in much of rural Romania until relatively recent times. Books circulated in limited numbers, literacy remained uneven, and opportunities for advanced learning were available to only a small part of the population. In that environment, knowledge itself could become extraordinary. A person able to calculate the calendar accurately or explain changes in the weather possessed abilities that many neighbors would never have encountered firsthand. The distance between education and mystery was often much smaller than it appears today. Perhaps for that reason, the tradition places learning at the center of their story. Curiously, almost nothing is said about the school itself. What they studied is equally difficult to determine. References survive to astronomy, seasonal cycles, and the movement of clouds, while a handful of traditions mention books containing unusual knowledge. Beyond that, the record becomes increasingly vague. Legends often survive because they leave space for imagination, allowing each generation to supply details that earlier storytellers considered unnecessary. Yet the idea endured. For centuries, it offered a simple explanation for an otherwise difficult question. If exceptional knowledge existed, somewhere there must have been a place where it could be learned. Many stories about them begin in an ordinary way. A traveler arrives in a village shortly before evening. He asks for food, a place to sleep, or simply a chance to warm himself beside the fire before continuing his journey the following morning. Nothing in the account suggests that those who welcomed him understood they were meeting anyone unusual. That detail appears repeatedly in Romanian folklore. The Solomonar is not introduced through spectacle or dramatic displays of power. Instead, he enters the story as an unfamiliar face among many others moving through the mountains. The physical description changes from one account to another. A walking staff appears frequently, and several collectors also mention a leather satchel or clothing worn thin by years of travel. The emphasis falls elsewhere. People remember the visit only after something unexpected happens. A violent storm changes direction. Hail falls on neighboring fields while leaving one village untouched. Rain arrives after weeks of drought. The stranger, long gone by then, returns to memory because ordinary explanations no longer seem sufficient. From the perspective of folklore, this pattern is revealing. Recognition comes after the event rather than before it. The significance of the traveler grows gradually as neighbors compare recollections and search for meaning in what they have experienced. Hospitality also plays an important role. Mountain communities depended on cooperation, and offering shelter to someone passing through was often regarded as part of everyday life. The legend places the Solomonar within that familiar custom instead of outside it. He shares the same table, sleeps beneath the same roof, and continues along the same road taken by merchants, shepherds, and pilgrims before disappearing into the landscape once again. Only later does the possibility arise that the visitor may have carried more knowledge than anyone realized at the time. By this point, another question naturally presents itself. If they were believed to influence the weather, how was that influence imagined? The surviving traditions approach the question in different ways. Instead, they preserve a collection of ideas that changed gradually as stories traveled from one community to another. Among the most enduring is the belief that storms were connected with creatures known in Romanian folklore as dragons. The dragon of Romanian tradition belongs to a different cultural world. It appears in legends, fairy tales, and regional beliefs with many different forms and attributes, making any simple definition difficult. Within the traditions surrounding the Solomonari, the dragon occupies a very specific role. Rather than serving as an enemy to be defeated, it becomes part of an explanation for violent weather. Folklore collected during the 19th century describes storms as events shaped by forces that ordinary people could neither observe nor influence directly. The Solomonari entered that unseen world through the stories told about them. Their relationship with the dragon varies from one account to another. Regional traditions describe different relationships between the creature and the storm. In many accounts, its movements are closely associated with gathering clouds and heavy rain. The details differ, yet the underlying idea remains surprisingly stable. Human actions alone could not account for every change in the weather. Something else was taking place beyond the limits of ordinary experience. To modern readers, these explanations belong to mythology. To the communities that preserved them, they formed part of a broader effort to understand the natural world. A dark cloud approaching was real. So was the hail that followed. Folklore attempted to connect those visible events with causes that could be imagined, discussed, and passed from one generation to the next. Within that framework, both the Solomonar and the dragon became part of the same explanation for forces that seemed impossible to control. Perhaps that is why the legend endured. Modern scholarship approaches the subject from different angles. A large part of the academic literature treats the Solomonar as legendary figure shaped through oral tradition, although the possibility that older memories contributed to those stories has never disappeared entirely. The available material supports discussion rather than certainty. Oral traditions are shaped by repetition, adaptation, and memory. Stories change as they pass from one generation to the next, often absorbing details from neighboring regions or from entirely different narratives. By the time Romanian folklorists began recording these traditions during the 19th century, the legend already contained references to wandering scholars, hidden places of learning, unusual knowledge, storms, and the mysterious creatures known as dragons. It is difficult to know when those elements first came together. No surviving source captures the moment the tradition began. Instead, the historical record reveals a long process during which separate ideas gradually formed a single narrative. That process continues to attract attention because it offers insight into the communities that preserved it. The stories reflect concerns about weather, respect for learning, and the importance of hospitality in isolated mountain regions. They also demonstrate the remarkable ability of oral culture to preserve themes across long periods of time, while allowing individual details to evolve. Historians approach the Solomonari as a difficult subject because the documentary evidence is limited. Folklorists are often more interested in the way the stories evolved and what they reveal about the communities that preserved them. Modern readers, in turn, gain a rare glimpse into the imagination of earlier generations and the ways people explained an unpredictable world. Perhaps that is the reason the tradition has survived. Every age asks different questions of the past. Their place in Romanian folklore remains secure regardless of whether they are approached as historical memory, symbolic tradition, or something that belongs entirely to the landscape of legend. As our journey comes to an end, the mountains fade once again into the darkness from which they emerged. Somewhere beyond the forest, clouds continue to gather above the mountains exactly as they did centuries ago. People understand them differently now. The storms have not changed. Only the explanations have. The stories remain where they have always belonged, among old notebooks, along forgotten roads, and wherever someone chooses to tell them once again.